The G8 says economic recovery too fragile to consider reversing stimulus efforts, even as the IMF upgraded its forecast for growth at least next year. Paul, the operative word here is next year. This year, forget it.
No, worse than that, things are actually deteriorating just a little bit this year. The IMF saying the world economy this year will contract about 1.4%. We're about to show that on the screen behind you. That's down from the 1.3%. There we go, 1.4% this year. Previously said just 1.3%. But look at next year, 2.5% growth. That's up from the 1.9% earlier forecast, though with a note of caution.
Yes, we're a bit more optimistic, but I mean, one has to keep it in perspective, right, which is that 2.5% is still far below the kind of growth rate you need to maintain unemployment constant. So this means that throughout 2010, we still basically predict an increase in unemployment. So it's good news, but it's not great news.
Now, the IMF report gave some early support to U.S. stocks. We take a look at this line here. That's the previous day's close. Support at the beginning of the day, but it faded away with investors concerned about earnings. Bernie.
Okay. Now, why the concern among the G8 nations? You and I have actually looked at a lot of the commentary on how some people feel the G8's actually an irrelevant group. They're not supposed to be the ones handing down this edict. There are a lot more important countries in the next half-decade.
And that is basically what the IMF was saying. The G8 represents the developed nations, of course, and they will lag the emerging nations. The IMF saying the US this year will shrink 2.6%, growing 0.8% next year. That's better than the flat it had previously forecast. Next year's forecast for China, though, 8.5%. That is a full percentage point increase, and it's up from 7.5% this year. India's growth upgraded both for this year and next. We're looking at 6.5% for next year for India. And if we take a look at Asia's former growth engine, Japan, well, the IMF more than trebled next year's growth forecast. That went up, though, to a mighty 1.7%. There we go. Now, this helps explain why the G8 is nervous about removing stimulus efforts and monetary easing. British Prime Minister Gordon Brown said the G8 needs to sound a second wake-up call, saying there are warning signals about the world economy that we cannot ignore. The British economy shrank at the fastest pace in 51 years in the first quarter, Bernie, and the IMF said Europe will lag even Japan and the US.
Okay, the envy of the OECD, the kind of things we're going through in the emerging markets. Stick around, Paul, because our next guest is on top of this issue and more. Dr. Jörg Zeuner, VP Bank Chief Economist, one of the largest banks in Liechtenstein, and previously he did stints with the IMF and the World Bank, so he understands the thinking at those NGOs. Doctor, good afternoon to us. Thank you very much for being on Asia Confidential today. If you look at it net, the world is getting a little better. It's taking a little while to get there, but we are going to get there.
This revision of the forecast was appropriate. We also expect that things are going to get better in the industrialized world, headed by the US and the emerging markets. So this revision is appropriate in our view.
Okay. I want to bring Paul into this discussion here. There's a little bit of difference in the language between the G8 and the IMF, Paul. I mean, if you look at the nuances, read between the lines there, different time horizons we're talking about here, no?
Of course, G8 leaders are standing for re-election, so that may make some of the difference. They want to make sure the economy stay on track. But Jörg, a question for you. SocGen, only a couple of weeks ago, said it believes that the China recovery is very overestimated, that basically it could be a giant trick. There will be non-performing loans in the future. We're still seeing no export leg to the economy. Are you concerned at all about China?
Well, we're not that concerned about China as you mentioned. I think that at the moment it's the domestic demand in China which is stimulated, that's correct, through fiscal measures and as well as monetary policy and the credit growth. But as the world economy recovers, with the US leading the way out, the second leg, the export sector, should be kicking in 2010 and then carry this recovery in China forward.
So you're confident of something like maybe not a V-shaped recovery, but a not too drawn-out W-shape, something like that?
Yeah, something like a U-shaped, sort of a long U in the US, but more of a V-shaped recovery in China, in fact.
Dr. Zeuner, there is among the G8 in Italy, there is a bit of a dichotomy in the views on stimulus. I mean, in referring to China, which we're talking about with Paul here, you know, it's the $4 trillion largely that's been responsible for keeping an offset to the export collapse going. But people like Dr. Merkel of Germany are more concerned about deficit reduction at a time when top people in the Obama administration are voicing some worries that there's going to be the need for a second round of stimulus. Are we going to see a divergence, a polarization in national priorities?
I think you already see that in the Eurozone, which I believe is one of the reasons why the Eurozone is lagging behind. The policy coordination that has to happen in the Eurozone just takes time, and it has taken time the ECB to respond. And then the somewhat different views on fiscal stimulus in France and Germany is driving problems within the Eurozone.
Is there room, Jörg, you think, for more stimulus packages? Governments can afford it?
I think we should let the ones that have been approved work. They're large in size, and in the US, for example, it's only $100 billion, I believe, that has been spent out of the $800 billion that has been approved. So this carries well into 2010, and then hopefully the rest of the economy, particularly the consumers, will have picked up confidence and then carry the recovery forward.